The morning sun streamed through the towering windows of Bradford County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Judge Richard Montgomery adjusted his reading glasses, suppressing a yawn as he reviewed the day's docket. 23 years on the bench had turned these morning sessions into a predictable routine. At precisely 9:15 a.m., the ancient grandfather clock in the corner chimed softly, its sound barely noticeable over the gentle murmur of waiting citizens. The judge's eyes remained fixed on his papers, mechanically processing one case after another. Next, he called out, his voice carrying the weight of countless similar mornings. The quiet shuffle of footsteps approached the bench. Something about their rhythm, confident yet unhurried, made Judge Montgomery glance up briefly. Before him stood a woman in her early 40s, wearing a cream-colored sweater with small paint splatters near the hem and well-worn jeans. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, though a few strands had escaped, suggesting a rushed morning. "Dr. Maya Richardson," she announced, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed out of place in the austere courtroom. The judge's gaze flickered momentarily to her casual attire, then back to his papers. He had seen thousands of defendants over the years, and his mind automatically filed her into familiar categories. Another routine case, another morning in court. What he failed to notice was the leather messenger bag at her side, stuffed with student manuscripts and a well-worn copy of Toni Morrison's Beloved peeking out from a side pocket. He missed the ink stains on her fingers from grading papers all night, and the slight dusting of chalk on her sleeve from the impromptu writing workshop she'd led just 30 minutes ago. "Case number 47B, Judge Montgomery intoned, reaching for his coffee cup. "Parking in a restricted zone on university property." He took a sip, grimacing at the now lukewarm liquid. The morning light caught his silver hair, creating a halo effect that seemed to emphasize his position of authority. Dr. Richardson stood straight, her posture reflecting years of presenting to packed lecture halls and literary panels. She opened her mouth to speak, but the judge had already turned to his clerk, asking for the next file. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath. The ornate ceiling, with its intricate moldings and careful restoration, had witnessed countless such moments over its 100-year history. The wooden benches, worn smooth by generations of waiting citizens, creaked softly as observers shifted in their seats. Among them sat Jamie Chen, a first-year law student observing court proceedings for her legal writing class. Her pen hovered over her notebook as she watched the scene unfold, sensing something significant in this seemingly ordinary moment. Dr. Richardson cleared her throat softly, drawing the judge's attention back. Her fingers absently traced the spine of Beloved in her bag, a habit she'd developed during particularly challenging moments. The morning sun had shifted now, illuminating her face with a gentle glow that highlighted the quiet determination in her eyes. Judge Montgomery looked up again, this time noting a certain poise in her bearing that didn't quite fit his initial assessment. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face, a momentary crack in the routine, a ripple in the predictable flow of his morning. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished behind his practiced judicial demeanor. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, marking the beginning of what would prove to be anything but an ordinary court session. The story of the next few minutes would eventually echo far beyond the marble walls of Bradford County Courthouse, though neither the judge nor Dr. Richardson could possibly know that yet. Dr. Richardson drew in a quiet breath, her hand resting lightly on the podium. The familiar scent of old books and polished wood reminded her of countless university lectures, though this venue demanded a different kind of performance. Through the tall windows, she could see maple leaves dancing in the morning breeze, a detail she might use in her next novel. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to holding an audience's attention. "I understand the seriousness of parking regulations at Boston University. I was scheduled to give a guest lecture on contemporary literature." Judge Montgomery's pen tapped against his desk, a subtle interruption that spoke volumes. "The facts of the case. Dr. Richardson. Just the facts. He glanced at his watch, a gleaming timepiece that caught the morning light. In the gallery, Jamie Chen's pen scratched rapidly across her notebook. Something about the judge's tone made her lean forward, legal pad balanced carefully on her knee. She wasn't the only one noticing the subtle shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Richardson adjusted her approach with the same skill she used to guide struggling writers through difficult revisions. Yesterday at 2:15 p.m., I parked in a reserved space near Marsh Chapel. My regular faculty spot was under construction, and I had 60 graduate students waiting. Did you or did you not see the clearly posted sign? The judge's question cut through her explanation like a paper's red editing marks. A shaft of sunlight illuminated the dust motes between them, dancing in the silence that followed. Dr. Richardson's fingers found the smooth surface of her phone in her pocket, where 15 missed calls from her publisher waited. The National Book Award ceremony was just 2 days away, and her acceptance speech remained unfinished. I saw the sign, Your Honor, she acknowledged, her tone remaining steady. However, my car's battery died unexpectedly. I couldn't move it until campus services arrived, which took longer than anticipated due to a staff meeting. The judge shuffled some papers, barely glancing at the photographs of her car in the reserved space. Behind his bench, a portrait of Justice Holmes gazed down with painted solemnity, witness to this modern moment of judicial procedure. The university's head of security personally authorized. Dr. Richardson began again, reaching for her phone to show the email confirmation. That will be all. Judge Montgomery's words fell like a gavel, though the wooden instrument itself remained untouched. The morning light caught his wedding ring as he made a note in the case file, reminding him of his wife's literary society meeting later that evening. In the back of the courtroom, a door opened quietly, letting in a brief whisper of conversation from the hallway. A young clerk entered, carrying a stack of papers that would soon become part of the day's official record. She paused, sensing the tension in the air. Dr. Richardson stood perfectly still, her posture reflecting years of navigating challenging academic committees and publishing house negotiations. The paint splatter on her sweater caught the light, a remnant of yesterday's creative writing exercise on descriptive imagery. The grandfather clock marked another minute, its steady rhythm accompanying the soft rustle of paper as Judge Montgomery prepared to deliver his decision. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, a brief reminder of the city beyond these mahogany-paneled walls. Jamie Chen glanced at her watch. Barely 15 minutes had passed since Dr. Richardson entered the courtroom. Yet somehow the air felt heavier, charged with unspoken words and mounting tension. The young law student couldn't know she was witnessing what would soon become a landmark case study in judicial conduct seminars across the state. The morning sun had shifted now, casting long shadows across Judge Montgomery's bench as he straightened his papers with practiced precision. The soft whisper of shuffling documents filled the momentary silence. He cleared his throat, a sound that echoed off the high ceiling and seemed to reverberate through the hushed courtroom. Dr. Richardson, he began, not looking up from his notes, this court takes university parking regulations seriously. These rules exist for a reason. His voice carried the weight of countless similar pronouncements, each word measured and familiar. In the gallery, Jamie Chen's pen hovered above her legal pad. She noticed how differently the judge's tone rang compared to his earlier cases. Gone was the gentle humor he'd shown to the young man with an expired meter, or the understanding nod he'd given the elderly woman who'd misread a street sign. Dr. Richardson stood perfectly still, her right hand resting lightly on her messenger bag. Through the worn leather, she could feel the outline of her students' manuscripts, each one waiting for her thoughtful feedback. A small smile touched her lips as she recalled one particular story about moments of unexpected grace. Given the clear signage and your admission to seeing it, Judge Montgomery continued, finally looking up, this court finds. He paused, momentarily caught off guard by the quiet dignity in Dr. Richardson's expression. Something flickered in his eyes, a brief hesitation, quickly masked by years of judicial procedure. The ancient radiator in the corner hissed softly, adding its voice to the morning's performance. Outside, a flock of pigeons took flight, their shadows dancing briefly across the courtroom's marble floor. This court finds you in violation and imposes a fine of $500. The words fell heavily in the quiet room. Next case, he added, reaching for his coffee cup. Dr. Richardson's expression remained unchanged, though her fingers tightened slightly on her bag strap. The touch reminded her of her father's words from years ago. Grace under pressure tells its own story. She reached into her bag, past the manuscripts and worn copy of Beloved, to retrieve her wallet. The clerk approached with paperwork, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The sound seemed to punctuate each moment as Dr. Richardson carefully wrote out the check, her handwriting as precise as the prose that had earned her recent acclaim. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough warmth to make several heads turn. She gathered her belongings with unhurried movements, the paint splatter on her sweater catching the light as she turned. Judge Montgomery had already called the next case, his pen moving mechanically across another set of papers. Yet something about Dr. Richardson's graceful exit made him glance up one final time, catching sight of her straight-backed silhouette against the morning light. Jamie Chen watched Dr. Richardson walk down the center aisle, noticing how conversations hushed as she passed. The law student's notes had evolved from simple case observations to something more complex, a study in contrasts, power, and the quiet strength found in dignity. As the heavy courtroom doors swung closed behind her, Dr. Richardson paused in the marble hallway. She pulled out her phone, quickly typing a message to her publisher about the next day's book signing. The morning light streamed through the building's historic windows, creating patterns on the floor that reminded her of stories yet to be written. The grandfather clock in the courtroom struck 10, its chimes following her down the corridor. In just a few hours, this moment would begin to ripple outward in ways neither she nor Judge Montgomery could possibly imagine. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza, their light catching the rim of Judge Richard Montgomery's untouched champagne glass. His bow tie felt unusually tight as he watched his wife Sarah weave through the crowd of Boston's literary elite, her face glowing with excitement. "Richard, you won't believe who's giving the keynote speech tonight." Sarah's voice bubbled with enthusiasm as she returned to their table, clutching an elegantly printed program. Her blue evening gown shimmered as she sat, leaning close to share her discovery. Dr. Maya Richardson. Her new novel about modern academia is absolutely brilliant. The New York Times called it a masterpiece of subtle observation. The judge's hand froze midway to his water glass. Something about the name tugged at his memory, like a loose thread waiting to unravel. "Richardson," he repeated, his judicial composure slipping ever so slightly. "Oh, look, there's her photo in the program," Sarah continued, smoothing the glossy page. "She just won the National Book Award, and they say she's the youngest recipient in her category. She teaches at Boston University when she's not writing bestsellers." The ballroom's ambient noise faded to a distant hum as Judge Montgomery stared at the photograph. The woman's eyes held the same quiet dignity he'd encountered that morning, though now she wore an elegant evening dress instead of a paint-splattered sweater. His collar felt even tighter. At the next table, two literature professors from Harvard were discussing Dr. Richardson's latest work. "Her chapter on institutional blindness is revolutionary," one said, gesturing with his dessert fork. "The way she explores how we overlook brilliance when it doesn't match our expectations." The judge reached for his champagne glass, if only to have something to do with his hands. Through the golden liquid, he watched the ballroom doors open. A ripple of excitement passed through the crowd as Dr. Maya Richardson entered, now dressed in a deep purple evening gown that caught the chandelier light. No paint splatters in sight. "Her publisher says she almost missed this evening," someone nearby remarked. "Something about an unexpected morning appointment." Sarah squeezed her husband's arm. "Look at how composed she is. I heard she spent the morning dealing with some bureaucratic nightmare. Yet here she is, ready to inspire us all. She paused, noticing her husband's unusual silence. "Richard, are you feeling all right? You've gone quite pale." The judge's mind raced back through the morning's proceedings, the rushed assumptions, the interrupted explanations, the dismissive tone he'd used. Each memory now carried a new weight, heavy with implications he couldn't ignore. Dr. Richardson moved through the crowd with grace, stopping to shake hands and share warm smiles. She was approaching their section of the room, her path inevitably leading toward the podium that stood just past their table. "Ladies and gentlemen," the event coordinator's voice rang out. "Please welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Maya Richardson, professor, National Book Award winner, and one of our city's most insightful voices." The applause thundered through the ballroom. Judge Montgomery's hands moved automatically to join in, though he barely heard the sound over the rushing in his ears. As Dr. Richardson passed their table, her eyes met his for just a moment. In that brief connection, he saw something that would haunt him more than anger or accusation ever could: simple, dignified recognition. The spotlight illuminated Dr. Richardson as she stood at the podium, her presence commanding the attention of every person in the grand ballroom. Judge Montgomery sat motionless, his dinner untouched, as her voice filled the space with measured warmth. "Stories," she began, "have the power to bridge the gaps between perception and reality." Her eyes swept across the room, passing over the judge without lingering. "This morning, I experienced something that reminded me why I write." Sarah leaned forward in her chair, entranced, while her husband fought the urge to loosen his bow tie. The ice in his water glass clinked softly as his hand trembled. "We often see what we expect to see," Dr. Richardson continued, her voice carrying years of careful observation. "A woman in a paint-stained sweater might be dismissed as unprofessional, when in fact she's just finished inspiring 60 young writers to find their voices." A soft murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. The judge's mind flashed back to the morning. The way he'd barely looked up, the interruptions, the assumptions that had felt so natural after 23 years on the bench. His fork scraped against fine china as he pushed away his untouched salmon. "But tonight isn't about morning encounters," Dr. Richardson smiled, her expression genuine. "It's about the power of words to open eyes and hearts." She pulled out her worn copy of Beloved from beside the podium, the same book that had peeked from her messenger bag that morning. As she read a passage about understanding and redemption, Judge Montgomery felt each word settle like weights on his conscience. The crystal chandeliers seemed to dim, focusing all attention on her voice, her presence, her undeniable brilliance. "Literature teaches us to look beyond first glances," she continued, closing the book gently. "It shows us that everyone, from a student to a professor, from a judge to a janitor, carries stories worth hearing." Sarah dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, moved by the speech. "Isn't she remarkable, Richard?" she whispered. But her husband could only nod, his throat tight with unspoken words. The ballroom erupted in applause as Dr. Richardson concluded her address. The judge's hands moved automatically, clapping while his mind raced through every case he'd heard that morning. How many other stories had he failed to hear? How many lives had he judged through the lens of hasty assumptions? Later, as couples swirled on the dance floor to soft jazz, Judge Montgomery stood alone by the tall windows. His reflection stared back at him from the dark glass, still dignified in his tuxedo, still carrying the authority of his position, but somehow different. Shaken, he watched Dr. Richardson across the room, surrounded by admirers discussing her books, her teaching, her insights. She handled each conversation with the same grace she'd shown in his courtroom, though now her worn sweater had been replaced by elegant purple silk. Sarah appeared at his side, champagne flutes in hand. "Shall we introduce ourselves? I'd love to tell her how much her books mean to me." "Not tonight," he replied softly, accepting the champagne but not drinking it. "Tonight is for listening." His wife looked at him curiously, unused to this quiet contemplation from her usually confident husband. The evening's final song drifted through the ballroom as Judge Montgomery stood at the window, watching the city lights blur through the glass. In his pocket, his phone held the beginnings of a letter he'd started to write. Words of apology, of recognition, of change. But like the stories Dr. Richardson had spoken about, it would need time, thought, and most importantly, truth. Jamie Chin sat in her favorite corner of the law school library, her laptop screen illuminating her focused expression. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting warm patterns across her notes from yesterday's courtroom observation. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered her opening line. The power of perception. A morning in courtroom 7, she typed, then paused. As editor of the Law Review's blog, she'd covered dozens of cases, but something about yesterday's proceedings wouldn't let her rest. 3 tables away, a group of students huddled around a phone, watching Dr. Richardson's National Book Award acceptance speech from the previous evening. "Can you believe she was in traffic court yesterday morning?" one whispered, right before winning one of literature's highest honors. Jamie's fingers found their rhythm on the keyboard. Justice wears a blindfold, but perhaps sometimes she peeks. Yesterday, I witnessed 2 versions of the same person, one seen, one unseen, and learned how titles and appearances shape our judgment. The article took shape quickly, free of accusation or sensationalism. Jamie wove together her observations with the precision she'd learned in Professor Martinez's legal writing class. She described the paint-splattered sweater and the elegant evening gown, the interrupted explanations, and the commanding keynote speech, the morning's dismissal, and the evening's acclaim. "Hey," her classmate Michael leaned over, "isn't that the judge who guest lectured in our ethics class last semester?" He pointed to her screen where she'd just described Judge Montgomery's demeanor. He seemed so different then. Jamie nodded, remembering the judge's passionate speech about fairness in the judicial system. That memory helped her craft the article's next section, exploring how even those dedicated to justice could be blindsided by unconscious assumptions. As the morning progressed, students and professors drifted by, drawn by hushed conversations about her work in progress. Professor Martinez stopped to read over her shoulder, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't just about one morning in court," he noted. "You're capturing something universal." Jamie's article grew beyond the simple recounting of events. She included quotes from Dr. Richardson's books about perception and judgment, weaving them together with her courtroom observations. The piece ended not with criticism, but with questions about how we all make split-second judgments and the stories we miss in our rush to conclusions. At 3:15 p.m., after one final review, Jamie hit publish on the Law Review's website. She closed her laptop, gathered her books, and headed to her next class, unaware that her article was already being shared across social media platforms. By evening, local news outlets had picked up the story. But unlike typical viral sensations, this one sparked thoughtful discussions rather than outrage. Law professors shared it with their students. Book clubs added Dr. Richardson's works to their reading lists. Judicial training programs bookmarked it for future reference. In his chamber, Judge Montgomery read the article on his desktop computer. His hand shook slightly as he reached for his reading glasses, but he didn't look away. Jamie's words held no malice, no accusation, only careful observation and gentle questions about the moments that make us reconsider our certainties. Outside his window, the sunset painted the courthouse steps in shades of gold and shadow. A young woman in a paint-stained jacket hurried past, reminding him of assumptions yet to be challenged, stories yet to be heard. On his desk, next to the article, lay a half-finished letter to Dr. Richardson, his third attempt to find the right words. The Massachusetts Judicial Conference Center buzzed with anticipation. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating rows of judges, lawyers, and legal professionals gathered for the annual symposium on excellence in jurisprudence. Dr. Maya Richardson stood quietly backstage, reviewing her notes one last time. 5 minutes, Dr. Richardson, a young event coordinator whispered, clipboard clutched to her chest. We've never had such a full house for a morning session. Dr. Richardson smiled, smoothing her emerald green blazer. This time, there were no paint stains, though she'd deliberately chosen a casual leather messenger bag, the same one from that morning in court. Sometimes, she knew, the most powerful messages lay in the smallest details. As she stepped onto the stage, she caught sight of Judge Montgomery in the third row. He sat straight-backed, attention focused forward, though his usual judicial confidence seemed tempered by something new, a willingness to listen. "Good morning," she began, her voice warm and steady. "Today, I'd like to talk about stories, not just the ones we write, but the ones we live." She placed her worn copy of Beloved on the podium, its presence a bridge between her worlds. 2 weeks ago, I experienced something that many would consider worthy of anger. The room grew still. Instead, I found myself fascinated by how a single morning could contain such perfect material for understanding human nature. She shared the story with grace, painting the scene without judgment. The rushed morning, the paint-stained sweater, the assumptions made. As she spoke, heads nodded in recognition. A judge in the front row glanced down at her designer briefcase, perhaps remembering similar snap judgments. "But this isn't about one morning or one decision," Dr. Richardson continued, moving away from the podium to connect more directly with her audience. "It's about the stories we tell ourselves when someone walks into our courtroom, our classroom, our lives." She pulled up a series of images on the screen behind her. A janitor working on his doctoral thesis between shifts, a homeless man who'd once been a celebrated composer, a teenager in a hoodie who volunteered at a senior center. "Every person who stands before you carries chapters you haven't read," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "Their stories might be written in paint stains or designer labels, in perfect grammar or broken English, in confidence or fear." In his seat, Judge Montgomery found himself taking notes, his usually pristine handwriting slightly uneven with emotion. Around him, other judges did the same, their pens moving quickly across legal pads. "The true measure of justice," Dr. Richardson concluded, "isn't in how quickly we can categorize people, but in how willing we are to pause, to look deeper, to read the full story before writing our judgment." The applause that followed wasn't the polite acknowledgement of a typical legal seminar. It rolled through the room in waves, carrying with it the sound of genuine understanding. Later, as attendees filed out for lunch, conversations hummed with reflection rather than gossip. Several judges lingered, sharing stories of their own moments of realization. A senior justice wiped her eyes discreetly, whispering to her colleague about a case from 20 years ago that she'd never forgotten. Dr. Richardson gathered her materials unhurriedly, accepting thank yous with genuine warmth. As she placed Beloved back in her messenger bag, she noticed Judge Montgomery waiting quietly at the edge of the stage. Their eyes met briefly, not in confrontation or accusation, but in shared recognition of how moments of difficulty could become foundations for change. 6 months later, the morning light painted soft shadows across courtroom 7. Judge Richard Montgomery adjusted his reading glasses, but this time, his movements carried a different weight. The wooden bench before him had been polished to a warm glow, much like the new perspective he'd gained since that transformative morning. "Next case," he called, his voice carrying a warmth that made several regular attendees exchange surprised glances. A young woman approached, clutching a stack of medical bills, her McDonald's uniform wrinkled from an overnight shift. "Please," he said, gesturing to the chair his staff had recently added near the bench, "sit down and tell me your story." The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly, and as she began to speak, the judge listened with an attention that would have seemed foreign to his former self. During a brief recess, he stepped into his chambers and noticed the latest issue of the Judicial Review on his desk. He smiled at the cover story, "Transforming Justice, One Story at a Time." Inside, a photograph showed him mentoring first-year law students, including Jamie Chen, whose article had helped spark this change. His phone buzzed softly, A message from Sarah about Dr. Richardson's new book released that evening at the local library. He'd been invited to introduce her, an honor that still humbled him. His prepared remarks sat in his jacket pocket, each word carefully chosen to reflect not just appreciation for her work, but recognition of how one morning could reshape a lifetime of assumptions. The afternoon sun found him in the courthouse library, where he'd established a monthly discussion group for judges and legal professionals. Today's topic was hidden stories in the courtroom. Around the table, his colleagues shared their own moments of revelation, their own discoveries of depth beneath surface judgments. Last week, shared Judge Martinez, I had a defendant appear in gym clothes. My old self would have immediately. He paused, chuckling. Turns out she's a physical therapist who'd rushed over after saving someone from a cardiac event. As the discussion continued, Judge Montgomery's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, students from the law school's new Community Understanding program filed past, each paired with a local resident from a different walk of life. The program had been his idea, inspired by Dr. Richardson's words about reading the full story. Later that evening, at the library event, he stood at the podium looking out at faces both familiar and new. Dr. Richardson sat in the front row, her latest book, Beyond First Glance, resting in her lap. She wore a pristine suit, though he noticed with appreciation the small paint splash on her laptop bag, now carried like a badge of honor. 6 months ago, he began, his voice steady, I learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of my judicial career. Not in law school, not from legal texts, but from a moment when I failed to see what was right in front of me. The room listened intently as he shared their story, not as a tale of mistake and redemption, but as a testament to the power of growth and understanding. As he spoke, he noticed Jamie Chen in the audience, recording his words for a follow-up piece that would inspire another wave of positive change. And so, he concluded, we learned that justice isn't just about the law. It's about taking the time to hear each person's full story, to look beyond our first assumptions, and to remember that every person who enters our courtrooms brings chapters of life we've yet to read. Dr. Richardson stepped up to the podium as the applause faded. Their handshake, witnessed by the gathered crowd, represented more than reconciliation. It symbolized the endless possibility of human understanding and growth, one story at a time.